Have you ever wondered what it felt like to face the deadliest sound on the beaches of Normandy? Not the roar of artillery, not the crash of waves, but the relentless tearing buzz of Hitler's buzzsaw, the MG42. On the morning of June 6, 1944, thousands of young Allied soldiers waded ashore into a storm of steel. Many of them had trained for months, even years, for this day. They knew there would be resistance. They knew there would be danger. But what many of them could not fully imagine was the horrifying efficiency of the machine gun nests dug into the cliffs and concrete bunkers above them. The MG42 was not just a weapon. It was an experience. Its stuttering roar could cut through surf, drown out shouted commands, and pierce straight into the nerves of men trying to find cover on a beach with nowhere to hide. Veterans later said its sound could freeze your blood, as if the weapon itself were not merely firing bullets but firing fear. But here's the question that history rarely lingers on. What happened to the men behind those guns? We know the statistics, the Allied casualties, the blood-soaked sands, the chaos of Omaha and Juno and Sword. But what about the gunners themselves? Those young Germans, and in some cases conscripts from occupied countries, who pulled the triggers. How long did they survive that day? What choices did they face once the Allies finally closed the distance? And when they surrendered, were they treated as prisoners, or something else? In this video we are going to dive deep into that forgotten perspective. We'll uncover the strange mixture of fear and duty that drove these crews, the tactics they used to deadly effect, and the brutal truth of what awaited them once their bunkers fell silent. Along the way we'll hear stories from both sides, of Americans and Germans, of medics and gunners, of survival and reprisal. And here's the paradox. The very weapon that made them so feared, the MG42, also sealed their fate. By drawing so much Allied attention, by mowing down entire waves of men, they became priority targets. And when the fight closed in, mercy was not always part of the equation. If you're fascinated by untold stories of World War II, by the human side of weapons and battles we think we already know, then you're in the right place. We'll take you into the bunkers, across the beaches, and through the silence that followed the storm. But before we begin, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, so you won't miss our future explorations into the hidden corners of military history. And if you find yourself gripped by today's story, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices back into the light. Now let's step back to that fateful morning of June 6, 1944, and stand for a moment behind the steel shield of an MG42 bunker, looking out at the sea. To understand what happened to MG42 gunners on D-Day, we first need to understand the weapon itself, and why it was both feared and cursed. When the MG42 appeared in 1942, it was unlike anything the world had seen. German engineers had designed it to replace the earlier MG34, which, though excellent, was too slow and too expensive to mass produce. The MG42 was the solution: stamped steel, roller-locked mechanism, and an astonishing rate of fire, up to 1,500 rounds per minute in the right conditions. To soldiers who faced it, that meant one terrifying thing: the gun seemed to fire in a continuous sheet of sound. American GIs who heard it for the first time compared it to a chainsaw chewing through timber, or canvas ripping endlessly. The British gave it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw. On the Eastern Front, Red Army veterans said they could pick out its scream above an entire battlefield. This sound was psychological warfare all by itself. Imagine being a 19-year-old infantryman, stepping off a landing craft, and instantly hearing that awful tearing roar echoing from the cliffs. Even before the bullet struck, it seemed to tell you, you will not survive this beach. The Germans knew exactly how effective this was. For years, they had trained their doctrine around the machine gun as the backbone of their squads and defensive positions. Unlike Allied armies, which tended to think of rifles as the core weapon, German infantry revolved around the gun. The MG42 was their hammer, their anchor, their shield. On defense, it was not simply one weapon among many, it was the centerpiece of every resistance nest, or Widerstandsnest, built along the Atlantic Wall. By 1944, the Germans had fortified hundreds of miles of coastline from Norway to the French border with Spain. Concrete bunkers, trenches, pillboxes, and gun emplacements dotted the cliffs and dunes. But on beaches like Omaha, they built something particularly lethal: overlapping fire zones. Each bunker with an MG42 was positioned not to fire straight out at the sea, but to rake the length of the beach. That meant any man who escaped one field of fire was instantly exposed to another. For the Allies, the beaches became giant shooting galleries with the gunners holding every card. Inside those bunkers, a typical MG42 crew consisted of 3 men. The gunner himself, crouched behind the weapon, peering through the sights. His assistant, feeding long belts of 7.92mm rounds into the chamber and swapping out the overheated barrels. And an ammunition bearer, carrying boxes of extra belts. The machine gun was powerful but temperamental. Its barrels glowed red after just a few minutes, and if not replaced quickly, the weapon could jam or melt. Each crew had to be practiced, disciplined, and ready to operate like a machine themselves. By June 1944, however, not all MG crews were hardened veterans. Some were. Many had fought in Russia, in North Africa, in Italy, and had already seen years of battle. But others were young replacements, 18 and 19-year-olds pulled from training camps and shoved into the Atlantic Wall. Some were conscripts from occupied countries, forced to wear the field gray uniform and serve under German officers. For them, the bunker was not just a duty post, it was a prison, one from which escape was almost impossible. Imagine their position on the night of June 5th. Darkness across the channel. Rumors of invasion spreading through the ranks. They had been told for months that the Allies would come. Some believed it would be Calais, others the Bay of Biscay. But when the reports came in of ships on the horizon, when the thunder of naval guns shook the bunkers even before dawn, they knew, this was it. The invasion had come. And they were about to meet it head-on. For German commanders, the mission was simple: stop the enemy on the beach. They believed, correctly, that if the Allies managed to establish a foothold inland, the Reich would be doomed. The best chance to repel the invasion was to annihilate it before it could take root. That meant one thing: the machine gunners had to keep firing no matter what, until either the sea was empty or they themselves were dead. And so, as the naval bombardment began in the early hours of June 6, MG42 crews huddled inside their reinforced bunkers. Tons of shells screamed overhead, slamming into the coastline. The sky lit up with fire. Earth and concrete shook. To the young soldiers inside, it felt as though nothing could survive such a pounding. Some whispered prayers, others clenched their jaws, waiting for the roof to collapse. But when the bombardment ceased, many bunkers remained intact. German engineers had designed them to endure. Then came the silence. The brief, eerie silence after the thunder of guns, before the horizon revealed its secret. A machine gunner peered through his slit and saw the sea filled with ships. More ships than he had ever imagined could exist. Troop transports, landing craft, destroyers, battleships. The sight was almost unreal, like something from another world. The Allies were coming. And the MG42 crews knew their orders. Hold, fire, and do not stop. When the first gray light of dawn spread across the channel, the invasion revealed itself in full. German soldiers who had braced through the bombardment rubbed dust from their eyes and looked out through narrow slits and embrasures. What they saw made many gasp. The sea was alive. Hundreds upon hundreds of landing craft plowed through the waves, their wakes crisscrossing like threads in a giant net. Behind them, columns of larger ships stood like a floating city on the horizon. Smoke drifted, flashes winked from naval guns, and the steady growl of engines rolled toward the beaches. For the MG42 gunners in their concrete nests, the sight was overwhelming. One recalled later that it was as though the entire world had come to attack us. Yet their orders remained the same. Wait until the landing craft were in range, then open fire. Do not waste ammunition, and above all, do not stop. Inside the cramped bunkers, the gun crews prepared. The assistant gunner checked belts of ammunition, stacking them for quick reloads. Each belt held 50 rounds, but gunners often linked them together into longer chains. Spare barrels lay ready in asbestos mitts, because after just 250 rounds, a barrel could glow red-hot and seize. Sweat ran down faces, though the morning air was cool. Outside, artillery shells still landed here and there, showering dirt onto the concrete roofs. Then came the landing craft. Wooden boats with steel ramps, crammed with soldiers, each man clutching his rifle, his pack, his helmet tilted low. For many, this was their first combat. They had trained for months, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of crossing an open beach under direct fire. The ramps crashed down. Officers shouted. Men surged forward into water, chest high, stumbling under the weight of their gear. Some tripped immediately. Others tried to swim, rifles held over their heads. All knew that every step exposed them to unseen barrels on the bluffs. That was the moment the MG42s began to speak. The sound tore across the water like ripping canvas amplified through the heavens. Continuous, mechanical, merciless. Long bursts stitched across the surf. Sand exploded. Water fountained red. In seconds, dozens of men went down. The weapon's speed was not just about volume. It created the illusion of omnipresence. Unlike slower machine guns, where one could sometimes pick out individual shots, the MG42 produced a ceaseless roar. Soldiers swore whole squads were being hit at once, when in fact a single gunner was sweeping his sight line back and forth with chilling efficiency. On Omaha Beach, sectors like Dog Green and Easy Red became charnel grounds. One company of the 116th Infantry Virginia National Guard lost nearly 90% of its men in the first minutes. Survivors described hitting the sand, too terrified to lift their heads. The instinct to stay flat was overpowering, but deadly because lying still on open sand made one an easy target. Sergeants screamed, "Get up, move forward." Yet each sprint meant leaving cover and gambling one's life on the hope the gunners were changing belts or barrels. The Germans called one tactic Rasenschnitt, mowing the lawn. Instead of firing at chest height, they aimed low, sweeping bullets across the sand to shatter legs and drop men instantly. Wounded soldiers cried out, drawing comrades and medics to help. That created new targets, multiplying casualties. Another trick was firing tracers high, deliberately misleading attackers into thinking the aim was off, while a second hidden gun fired at lethal height. Simple tricks, devastating results. Still, against this storm of fire, small groups of Allied infantry began to adapt. Hugging tank traps, crawling into shell craters, even hiding behind the dead, they inched forward. Their training had included one grim lesson: attack during the MG42's pauses. A pause might last only seconds, the time it took to reload or swap a barrel, but in those seconds men leapt to their feet and charged. One such charge was led by a sergeant with a bazooka team. His target, WN-61, a strong point pouring fire into the beach. First, they knocked out a 50mm anti-tank gun that supported the machine guns. Then, sprinting under cover of smoke, they got close enough to toss grenades and fire rockets at the embrasures. 7 defenders died in that assault. 2 MG42s fell silent. The Americans lost 1 man killed and 1 wounded, a terrible price but far less than what the guns had already inflicted. Their action opened a small but vital gap for others to push inland. At Dog White, U.S. Rangers made a similar assault. They crawled forward under cover of artillery smoke, then stormed a bunker with grenades and flamethrowers. At Easy Red, combat engineers risked everything to blow obstacles and clear lanes through the wire. Once breaches were made, more infantry scrambled through, scaling the bluffs to outflank the nests from above. But each success was bought in blood. The closer the attackers got, the more terrifying the fight became. Reaching a bunker was only half the battle. Inside, the clash turned brutal and intimate, grenades tossed through slits, satchel charges shoved into firing ports, flamethrowers roaring in narrow corridors. Seconds of violence decided the fate of crews who had hours earlier looked invincible. For MG42 gunners, the bunker that had seemed like safety quickly became a coffin. The thick walls protected against naval shells, but they also trapped the crew. The same embrasures that gave them a deadly field of fire now boxed them in. If attackers closed to grenade range, there was often no escape. Some tried to flee out the back, scrambling over dunes and hedges. Others fought to the end, determined not to be captured. And capture was its own terrifying prospect. Every German machine gunner knew they were hated. Allied soldiers had watched their friends cut down in waves, and emotions ran hot. Officially, the Geneva Convention demanded that prisoners be taken and protected. Unofficially, in the fury of battle, not every surrender was accepted. Accounts exist of gunners being shot after throwing down their weapons, acts of reprisal in the heat of vengeance. Such incidents were rarely recorded, but veterans whispered of them afterward. By noon, on many parts of Omaha, the tide had begun to turn. Not because the MG42s had run out of will, many fought on until their last round, but because sheer numbers, determination, and improvisation carried the day. Allied infantry clawed their way up the bluffs, silencing nests one by one. When the last machine gun in a sector was knocked out, the change was immediate and dramatic. The curtain of fire lifted. Men who had been pinned for hours suddenly surged forward. Engineers cleared paths for vehicles. Tanks and reinforcements began to move inland. The German line, once unbreakable, started to fracture. For the gunners, it meant either death, surrender, or retreat through a landscape of fire and blood. For the attackers, it meant that the worst killing fields of the morning had finally been crossed. But the memory of those nests and the sound of the MG42 would never leave them. By the afternoon of June 6, the beaches no longer looked like beaches. They were graveyards of twisted metal, broken boats, and bodies strewn across the sand. Smoke rolled inland from burning strongpoints, and the constant thunder of naval guns shook the ground. Yet, amid the devastation, the Allies were finally pushing up the bluffs. For the infantry who survived the gauntlet, one truth remained: the MG42 was the nightmare that defined D-Day. Veterans spoke of hearing it long before they saw the bunkers. A tearing, buzzing roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Some said it reminded them of ripping cloth, others of a chainsaw cutting through hardwood. But whatever the description, the sound carried terror. The MG42 froze you in place, one American veteran admitted years later. It was like being caught in headlights, knowing the next second could be your last. Landing craft ramps had dropped, and many soldiers instinctively hugged the ground, pressing into wet sand as bullets hissed above. Officers and NCOs screamed themselves hoarse to get their men moving. "If you stay here, you die," one squad leader shouted, forcing himself to stand upright under fire, simply to prove to his men that movement was still possible. That blend of leadership and desperation is what kept the assault moving forward. For the German gunners, the psychological burden was no lighter. Imagine being a 19 or 20-year-old, sitting behind the gun in a concrete box, looking out at the largest armada in history. It was awe and dread combined. On Strong Point WN62 above Omaha Beach, a 20-year-old gunner named Heinrich Su later described the view as unreal, ships and men as far as I could see. When the order came, he opened fire. For 9 hours he fed belt after belt through his MG42, alone after his assistant gunner was killed. By his own account, he fired nearly 12,000 rounds that day, until his ammunition was gone and the position collapsing around him. He survived only by retreating through shell craters and hedgerows, surrendering the next morning. But Su's story was unusual because he lived. Many crews did not. The interior of a bunker under attack was a terrifying place. The air filled with smoke and dust, echoing with the gun's deafening roar. Heat from the barrel made it feel like sitting beside a forge. Each burst shook the concrete walls, rattling teeth and bones. The gunner's focus narrowed to the field of fire, target after target, indistinguishable faces in the chaos. And always the gnawing fear: what happens when they get close? The closer the Allies crawled, the more the gunners' confidence shrank. The same firing ports that gave them killing zones also trapped them, limiting movement and escape. They could hear footsteps outside, shouts in English, the metallic clank of grenades bouncing against walls. A few seconds later, an explosion inside the room, shrapnel bouncing off concrete, ears ringing, lungs gasping in smoke. Then came satchel charges, flamethrowers, or storming infantry pouring through the entrance with rifles and bayonets ready. In such moments, surrender seemed the only option. But surrender was its own gamble. MG42 crews were marked men. Allied infantry, having lost brothers and friends to the buzzsaw, sometimes saw red. While many gunners were taken prisoner, others never made it past the first attempt to throw up their hands. Not everyone's surrender was accepted, one after-action report admitted obliquely. The Geneva Convention demanded prisoners be spared, but on a day when entire companies had been shredded in minutes, mercy was a fragile thing. And not every gunner was a hardened Nazi or veteran of earlier campaigns. By 1944, many positions were manned by replacements, young conscripts, some not even German. There were Poles, Czechs, and Ukrainians pressed into Wehrmacht service. For them, fighting was less about ideology than fear of their own officers or simply survival. Some surrendered quickly once their position was hopeless, hands raised high in desperate hope. Others fought on, convinced surrender wouldn't save them. That duality created moments of brutal uncertainty. Imagine the scene: an MG42 crew finally runs out of ammunition. The gun barrel smokes uselessly. They shout above the chaos, "Kamerad! Kamerad!" with hands raised. Outside, the Americans hesitate. Some men lower their weapons. Others keep firing, unable to stop after seeing friends die only minutes before. The bunker becomes a stage for rage and decision-making, with lives hanging in the balance. The strain cut both ways. For the Allied soldiers attacking the nests, every yard forward was a gamble. Some made it within a few meters only to be cut down seconds before they could throw a grenade. Others watched comrades burn when flamethrowers roared too close. Success meant survival but also guilt. You lived, your friend beside you did not. The fight was never clean. It was not the tidy, textbook maneuver of military manuals. It was chaos, improvisation, and raw willpower. And the knowledge that silencing one gun meant dozens, maybe hundreds, of lives could be saved behind you. That responsibility drove men to risk everything against the most feared weapon on the beach. By early afternoon, more and more nests had been knocked out. Not all at once, but piecemeal. Here a team of engineers clearing a wire, there a group of rangers scaling a cliff, elsewhere an infantry squad storming a bunker. Gradually the German curtain of fire began to thin. Where before every step brought bullets, now there were moments of silence. Enough silence to move, to reorganize, to push inland. For the MG42 gunners who survived, those hours became the defining memories of their lives. Some carried the weight in silence for decades, ashamed of what they had done, yet also haunted by what they had endured. Others sought out reconciliation, meeting Allied veterans later in life to share stories and unburden themselves. The sound of the weapon, though, never left either side. American soldiers admitted they could still hear it in dreams, decades later. German veterans called it a symbol of both pride and guilt, a machine of unmatched efficiency that had also made them hated above all. On June 6, the MG42 shaped the battlefield like no other weapon. It created the horror of the killing beaches, but also drew the fiercest determination from the men who faced it. And in the end, despite the fear it spread, it could not stop the invasion. By the time the afternoon sun climbed high over Normandy, the tide of battle was turning. The beaches that had seemed like death traps in the morning were now slowly being wrestled from German control. Small groups of American infantry, engineers, and rangers had clawed their way past the killing zones, finding paths through smoke, craters, and shattered obstacles. One nest at a time, the defenses were falling. From a distance, the bluffs above Omaha seemed impregnable, with concrete bunkers perched like predators over the sand. But up close, cracks in the German defense began to show. The overwhelming firepower of the MG42 was devastating in the open, yet once soldiers reached the base of the cliffs, the guns' angles were limited. Scaling parties found that the very bunkers which raked the beach with deadly fire were blind to the cliffs beneath them. Rope ladders, grappling hooks, even bare hands were used to climb, while covering fire from offshore destroyers pounded the higher positions. It was brutal work. Men clung to wet rock as bullets spattered around them. In some cases, destroyers steamed in dangerously close, within 1,000 yards of shore, to fire directly into pillboxes with point-blank naval guns. Sailors later said they could see German gunners through their binoculars, and fired until the concrete cracked. That combined pressure gave infantrymen the chance to get close enough for grenades and charges. As strongpoint after strongpoint collapsed, isolated MG42 crews found themselves surrounded. Some held on, firing until the barrels warped and ammunition ran out. Others chose to flee through communication trenches, only to be hunted down in the bocage beyond. And some surrendered, emerging with hands raised, their faces pale and uniforms streaked with dust and sweat. What happened next depended on timing and emotion. Official orders stressed adherence to the Geneva Convention. Prisoners were to be disarmed, searched, and sent to collection points. But in the chaos of Omaha Beach, where entire platoons had been cut down in minutes, emotions were raw. American veterans later admitted that captured machine gunners were often despised above all others. "Those guns murdered too many of our boys," one infantryman said decades later. It was hard to look at the man behind it and think of him as just another soldier. Some gunners were marched to the rear unharmed. Others were not so fortunate. There are scattered accounts, rarely written into official reports, of MG crews being shot after capture. Whether in revenge, fear of counterattack, or sheer fury, not every surrender was accepted. These incidents remain in the shadows of history, whispered in memoirs and hinted at in oral histories, but they underline the extraordinary bitterness of that day. For those who did survive as prisoners, the shock was profound. Stripped of weapons and marched through the same killing grounds they had once dominated, they saw the cost of their firepower. Rows of American dead, medics working frantically among the wounded, wrecked tanks and boats smoldering in the surf. Some German prisoners later admitted that only then did they realize the scale of the carnage their guns had caused. Meanwhile, for the Americans, reaching the top of the bluffs was transformative. After hours of being pinned down, suddenly they had space to maneuver. The high ground, once the Germans' advantage, now became the Allies'. From the ridge, engineers cleared obstacles, infantry spread out, and artillery observers began directing fire inland. Supply routes opened, allowing ammunition and reinforcements to move forward. The battle for the beach was not over, but the worst was behind them. And still the MG42 remained a lingering threat. Even as nests on the bluffs fell silent, portable versions of the gun were carried inland by retreating Germans, used in ambushes among hedgerows. The Americans soon learned that the weapon's fearsome reputation did not end at the shoreline. But on June 6, the concentrated power of the MG42 on fixed defenses was broken. The after-action reports paint a grim but proud picture. One summary from Omaha Beach declared, "The high ground was taken solely through the plain undaunted heroism of the infantry and their engineers, after the pre-landing bombardment had failed." The wording says everything. Technology, planning and firepower had not been enough. It was individual courage. Men charging through bursts of MG42 fire, crawling forward with explosives, storming concrete bunkers at bayonet point, that cracked the Atlantic wall. For the MG42 gunners, survival often meant silence. Many avoided admitting their role during capture, blending in with ordinary riflemen. They knew too well that the men escorting them back had seen friends killed by the buzzsaw. For those who were identified, the fear of reprisal hung heavy. Some American guards kept their distance, treating machine gunners as dangerous even without weapons. Others vented anger in harsh treatment. Yet, despite everything, the majority of prisoners were processed according to regulation. By the end of June 6, thousands of Germans, including machine gunners, were on their way to POW cages in England. For them the war was over. For the Allies, the beachhead was secure, though at a terrible cost. As evening fell over Normandy, the beaches no longer rang with the endless chatter of MG42s. Instead, the sounds were of waves washing against wreckage, of groaning wounded being carried to aid stations, of bulldozers clearing paths inland. The terror of the morning had given way to exhaustion and grim relief. The Allied bridgehead was fragile, but it existed. And the men who had faced the deadliest machine gun in the world could finally breathe, if only for a moment. The story of D-Day is filled with tanks, ships, and paratroopers, but at its heart, it was the duel between infantrymen and machine gunners that decided the outcome. The MG42, for all its speed and ferocity, could not hold back the tide forever. Against it stood men who refused to stop moving forward, crawling, sprinting, or simply staggering one bunker at a time. By nightfall, the Germans knew the invasion had succeeded. The Atlantic Wall, once touted as impregnable, was breached. And the feared MG42, the so-called Hitler's buzzsaw, had met its match in sheer human determination. The beaches were behind them, but the terror of the MG42 was not. As American and Allied troops pushed inland, they encountered a new kind of battlefield, the bocage country of Normandy. To anyone who has never seen it, bocage looks deceptively peaceful. Rolling fields bordered by hedgerows, sunken lanes winding between orchards and villages, the countryside dotted with stone farmhouses. But in June 1944, these hedgerows became a fortress, and the MG42 was the perfect weapon for it. A hedgerow in Normandy was no ordinary hedge. Many were centuries old, thick with roots, soil, and stones, some standing shoulder-high or taller. They offered cover for defenders, concealment for machine guns, and natural firing lanes along narrow lanes. For Allied troops advancing from one field to another, each hedgerow was a wall of uncertainty, and often, just beyond it, a waiting MG42. The difference from the beaches was stark. On Omaha, the guns had been fixed in concrete bunkers, their arcs of fire mapped out. Inland, they became mobile, wielded by small teams who knew every fold of the terrain. German squads often carried an MG42 as their centerpiece, supported by riflemen who maneuvered around it. In practice, this meant that every skirmish, every bend in the road, every orchard, every farmyard, risked erupting into a storm of 7.92 mm rounds delivered at terrifying speed. Allied veterans later recalled that in the bocage, You rarely saw the gunner before he opened fire. The sound came first, tearing the air apart, then the chaos of men diving for cover. One American infantryman described it simply: every field felt like a trap, and the MG42 was always waiting. To fight back, the Allies had to adapt quickly. Platoons developed tactics on the fly, one group laying down covering fire while another tried to outflank the hidden nest. Engineers blasted gaps in hedgerows with explosives, while tanks fitted with steel prongs, so-called rhino tanks, pushed through obstacles to surprise German defenders. Even so, casualties mounted. The MG42's rate of fire meant that a single burst could cut down men before they even realized where the rounds were coming from. For the German gunner, the bocage was both opportunity and torment. On one hand, the terrain gave them endless ambush points. A small team with a well-sighted MG42 could hold up an entire company for hours. But on the other hand, it was a war of nerves. Every trigger squeeze revealed their position. Every burst invited artillery or tank fire in response. And unlike in the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, there was no reinforced concrete here. Cover was earthen hedges and trees, and those could be shredded by shellfire in seconds. The strain of manning an MG42 in the bocage was relentless. Crews were expected to keep firing until the enemy withdrew or until their position was overrun. Ammunition had to be lugged through narrow lanes, barrels swapped out under fire, belts kept dry in the rain and mud. Many crews found themselves cut off as American units advanced around them. Some fought to the last, others tried to slip away, but the cycle was always the same: ambush, counterattack, retreat. Allied soldiers grew skilled at recognizing the patterns. Veterans knew to listen for the short pauses when the gunner changed barrels or belts. They learned to coordinate their rushes in those fleeting seconds, sprinting through fire that moments earlier seemed impassable. Bazookas, mortars, and grenades became their answer to the gun that dominated every skirmish. Still, the toll was heavy. Some rifle companies lost half their men in the first weeks in Normandy. Officers described the bocage as a machine gunner's paradise and an infantryman's nightmare. The MG42 was the beating heart of that nightmare. For the German gunner, survival was uncertain even in victory. Each belt of ammunition expended brought the Americans closer. Each ambush carried the risk of discovery. And when the Allies responded with overwhelming firepower, mortars, artillery, tank shells, the light cover of the bocage offered little safety. Crews often lived moment to moment, moving from one hedge to the next, their ears ringing from constant bursts, nerves frayed by the knowledge that once spotted, their life expectancy could be measured in minutes. Some German veterans later admitted that the weapon they trusted most also became their greatest burden. The MG42 was feared, yes, but it also marked its crew as priority targets. If the Americans spotted muzzle flashes or heard the signature buzzsaw, everything available was unleashed on that point. To be an MG42 gunner was to live in a constant duel of predator and prey, hunter one moment, hunted the next. And yet, despite the terror, many German squads relied on their gunners for survival. In Normandy's hedgerows, the MG42 was often the only thing preventing American breakthroughs. Its rapid bursts bought time for retreats, for counterattacks, or simply for survival another day. Even Allied commanders admitted grudging respect. Reports noted the tenacity of German machine gun crews, and the weapon's ability to pin down large forces with minimal manpower. But like on D-Day itself, the MG42's power could not stop the tide. As weeks passed, the Allies grew stronger, their tactics more refined, their numbers overwhelming. Air power hunted German positions relentlessly, artillery hammered crossroads and villages, and tanks punched through even the strongest hedgerows. For every MG42 nest that bled an American platoon, another 3 were silenced by combined fire. By late July, as Operation Cobra unleashed the breakout from Normandy, the story was clear. The MG42 was still deadly, still feared, but it could no longer dictate the battle. The Allies had absorbed its shock, learned its tricks, and paid the price in blood to overcome it. For the men who manned those guns, however, the scars were permanent. Allied veterans remembered the sound as the most terrifying of the war. German veterans remembered the weight of responsibility, the sense of being hated and hunted, and the knowledge that every pull of the trigger carved another wound into history. In the bocage, the MG42 proved both its brilliance and its curse. It was the perfect weapon for defense, and the perfect target for revenge. By the time the Allies broke out of Normandy in late July 1944, The war in Western Europe was entering a new phase. German defenses crumbled under the combined weight of air power, armor, and infantry. Entire divisions were encircled in the Falaise pocket, their retreat turned into chaos. Yet even in that collapse, the rattle of the MG42 was never far away. Retreating units set up rearguard actions, and almost invariably, those rearguards revolved around one or two machine guns. For the Allies pushing forward, it was a frustrating paradox. German formations were beaten, their tanks destroyed, their command structure collapsing. Yet small groups of men with an MG42 could still delay advances for hours. A single gun positioned at the edge of a village or behind a hedgerow could force entire battalions to deploy cautiously, wasting time and exposing themselves to artillery counterfire. In the words of one U.S. officer, the Wehrmacht was broken, but its machine guns made us pay for every mile. That pattern repeated itself all the way through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. On the Siegfried Line, where bunkers and dragons' teeth slowed Allied armor, MG42s defended pillboxes and trench systems. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, German infantry once again relied on their machine gunners to anchor surprise attacks. Even when resources dwindled, when fuel and ammunition were scarce, the MG42 remained central to German tactics. And yet, as the war dragged toward its inevitable conclusion, the fate of the gunners themselves grew darker. They were no longer fighting with the confidence of 1940 or the discipline of 1942. Many were teenagers, pressed into service after a few weeks of training, handed one of the most feared weapons of the war and told to hold the line. Others were veterans, exhausted from years of combat, their nerves worn thin, carrying the weight of battle stretching back to North Africa or the Eastern Front. For both, the MG42 was both lifeline and death sentence. Lifeline because it gave them power, a weapon that could make even a small group feel formidable. Death sentence because Allied troops had learned exactly what to do when they encountered one. Call in mortars. Bring up tanks. Hammer the position with everything until it was silent. To pull the trigger on an MG42 in late 1944 or early 1945 was to announce your presence to a vastly superior enemy, and to invite a storm of fire in return. Veterans of both sides recalled that MG crews rarely lasted long once discovered. In open ground they were obliterated. In cities they were flanked and burned out with flamethrowers. In forests artillery rained down. The weapon's effectiveness never diminished, but its survivability did. By 1945, the average life expectancy of a German machine gunner in combat was measured in days. And yet some survived. After the war, the MG42 became both infamous and strangely respected. Allied soldiers who had cursed it in Normandy later admitted that it was a masterpiece of engineering. German veterans, when interviewed in the decades after, often spoke of their mixed feelings. Pride in its effectiveness, shame in the destruction it caused, and an enduring memory of the fear it inspired, not only in the enemy but in the men who wielded it. One striking fact is how the MG42 outlived the Reich that built it. When Germany was divided after the war, both East and West retained versions of the gun. The West German Bundeswehr adopted an updated model called the MG3, chambered in NATO 7.62 mm, which remains in service even today. East Germany used Soviet-influenced designs but still drew upon lessons learned from the MG42's blistering rate of fire. Other nations too took notice. The Swiss developed the MG51, heavily inspired by it. The Spanish adopted the MG42-59. Even countries outside Europe, such as Pakistan and Turkey, ended up using derivatives. In many armies, the buzzsaw never really went away. It simply changed calibers and designations, its terrifying sound echoing across decades. For historians, this longevity tells a larger story. The MG42 wasn't just a weapon of its time, it was a glimpse of the future. It represented the shift from bolt-action rifles and slow-firing support weapons to a new kind of battlefield, one dominated by automatic fire and squad-based tactics. In many ways, modern infantry doctrine, where a squad revolves around its machine gunner, traces its lineage directly to the MG42. But for the men who lived through it, technical legacies mattered less than human survival. The Allied veterans who stormed Normandy never forgot the sound of the MG42. Many said it haunted their dreams for the rest of their lives. German veterans rarely spoke of it at all outside circles of comrades. For them, the gun was tied too closely to moments of trauma, The cries of wounded men, the sudden silence of a position overrun, the sight of friends burned alive in their bunkers. In interviews conducted decades later, some admitted that the MG42 had made them feel like kings of the battlefield for a few fleeting minutes, only to realize later that it had also painted a target on their backs. One former gunner put it bluntly, "Every time we opened fire, I knew we would not be there much longer. We could kill many, but then everything came for us." And that was the cruel paradox of the MG42. It gave power but also doomed those who used it. It terrified enemies, but it also condemned its crews to isolation and hatred. It was, as one Allied soldier later reflected, the most effective weapon of its kind, and the most cursed. By the spring of 1945, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine and advanced deep into Germany, the MG42 was still firing from ruined buildings, forests, and improvised defenses. But its roar could not alter the outcome. The Reich was collapsing, and even the most feared machine gun in the world could not hold back the tide. For the gunners still manning their posts, the choice was stark: die at their weapon or surrender and hope their captors showed mercy. Some, like Heinrich So from Omaha Beach, lived long enough to find reconciliation decades later. Others disappeared into history, their names forgotten, their stories buried under rubble. What endured was the memory of the weapon itself, the chilling rattle that symbolized the horror of modern war. And in that memory lies the true legacy of the MG42, not just as a piece of engineering brilliance, but as a reminder of what it meant for the men on both ends of its barrel. As the war ended in May 1945, Europe fell eerily quiet. The guns that had thundered across continents finally ceased their fire. In that silence, survivors began to reckon with what they had endured. For those who had faced the MG42, on the beaches of Normandy, in the bocage of France, amid the ruins of German cities, the silence was as strange as it was welcome. For once there was no rattle, no tearing canvas sound that could freeze a man in place. But the memories never faded. For Allied infantry, the MG42 was more than a weapon. It was a constant reminder that survival often hinged on seconds, on luck, on whether the gunner had to reload at the right moment. Many veterans later admitted they could still hear its sound decades later, unbidden, in dreams. To them it was the soundtrack of fear. For German machine gunners, the legacy was more complicated. The MG42 had given them power, the ability to halt entire battalions, to dominate a battlefield from a single bunker. Yet it also brought isolation, danger, and stigma. They were the first to be targeted, the most hated by their opponents, and the ones most often annihilated in their positions. Some lived long enough to reflect, others died anonymously in fields and trenches, remembered only as part of a nameless crew behind a nameless gun. History, however, rarely forgets weapons as effective as the MG42. Military analysts still study it, soldiers still train with its descendants, and war museums echo with its fearsome reputation. The Bundeswehr's MG3, still carried by German troops, is a direct descendant of the buzzsaw. In fact, its sound remains unmistakable. In many ways, the MG42 never really disappeared. Yet perhaps the deeper legacy is not mechanical but human. What the MG42 revealed is a truth that endures across all wars, that technology magnifies both courage and suffering. It allowed small groups to hold back great armies, but it also turned young men into targets, into instruments of slaughter, into figures who carried unbearable guilt long after the shooting stopped. Think of the irony. The Allies faced the MG42 with dread, but they won by adapting, by enduring, by throwing everything they had at its positions. The Germans wielded it with deadly skill, yet in the end it brought them no victory, only prolonging battles that could not change the war's outcome. The weapon was brilliant, but brilliance without hope is a hollow thing. For those who walk the beaches of Normandy today, the bunkers still stand. Some are shattered, some weathered by time, but many remain, silent, empty, their firing slits staring out over calm seas. Tourists step inside, touch the concrete, and imagine what it was like on that day. For some, it is almost impossible to believe that here, once, men behind MG42s unleashed storms of fire into the chaos of D-Day. And yet, the echoes linger. Every generation that visits is confronted with the same questions. How did men endure it? What drove them to keep moving forward? And what became of those who fought from behind the gun? These questions do not have simple answers. But they remind us that history is not only about nations and battles, but about individuals, young men who lived, fought, feared, and remembered. The MG42 stands as a symbol of World War II's extremes. It embodied both innovation and terror, engineering brilliance and human tragedy. For the Allies, defeating it was proof of determination. For the Germans, wielding it was a grim duty that often ended in annihilation. And for us, looking back, it is a reminder of the cost of war, where even the most advanced weapons cannot escape the weight of human suffering. So, the next time you hear that rattling sound in a documentary or see one of those concrete bunkers on the bluffs of Normandy, remember the men on both sides. Remember the Allied soldier who sprinted forward under fire, praying for just 1 second of cover. Remember the German gunner who held the trigger, knowing that with every round fired, his chances of surviving shrank. Remember that behind the statistics, the strategies, and the weapons, there were human beings caught in a storm larger than themselves. And that is why we tell these stories. To honor them, to learn from them, and to ensure that what they endured is never forgotten. If you found this story compelling and if you want to hear more hidden truths from World War II, about the men, the machines, and the battles that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Leave a like if you want more long-form history deep dives and share this video with anyone you know who loves history as much as you do. Because the past still speaks and it has lessons for all of us. The MG42 taught the world about the terrifying power of technology, but also about the resilience of ordinary soldiers in extraordinary times. Those echoes of Normandy still matter today. And by keeping their stories alive, we make sure the silence that followed the war remains unbroken.